Under the bright glow of Hollywood's golden age, Dick Van Dyke stood like a lighthouse, warm, steady, impossibly radiant. For generations, his laughter softened living rooms, his charm threaded itself into childhood memories, and his face became so familiar that audiences felt they truly knew the man behind the smile.
But they didn't. Not really.
Because somewhere beneath that effortless grin, beneath the dances, the jokes, the iconic roles and ageless optimism, there was a part of Dick Van Dyke's life that the world never saw, a part that remained sealed away, untouched, unspoken, and protected long after the camera stopped rolling. Even now, after nearly a century of life, people still struggle to understand how the most wholesome man in entertainment could carry a truth so heavy for so long. A truth that hid in plain sight, woven quietly between interviews, performances, and photographs. A truth he guarded for 3 full decades. A truth no one expected.
A truth no one questioned.
A truth that, once revealed, changed everything. And so this story begins not with certainty, but with doubt. Not with answers, but with the unsettling realization that something in Dick Van Dyke's life was never what it seemed. For 30 years, America adored one version of him, but another version lived in the shadows, waiting for the day the world would finally understand. Long before the rumors, long before the whispers of a life divided in two, Dick Van Dyke appeared to be the most transparent man Hollywood had ever seen. When he walked into a room, he didn't just brighten it. He seemed to expand it, filling every empty space with the kind of warmth people normally associate with childhood, holidays, and simpler times. From the moment he arrived in show business, he embodied a rare purity. The world saw him as the kind of man who couldn't pretend even if he tried, which made him perfect for the era he found himself in. Television was young, families gathered around glowing screens, and America desired someone who felt like home.
Van Dyke became that home.
He wasn't the polished, intimidating Hollywood star. He was the friendly next-door neighbor who suddenly appeared on national television, tripping over furniture and laughing at his own mistakes. But behind that disarming comfort lay something quietly unusual. He didn't push himself into fame. Fame pulled itself toward him.
It wanted him. It needed him.
His talent, his charm, and his sincerity created a gravitational field of their own. Yet from the earliest days, even as he was rising with astounding speed, people close to him noticed something subtle. Something so faint that most ignored it.
A pause in his smile.
A drifting look during celebration. A strange internal tug-of-war that he carried silently. Nothing loud. Nothing scandalous. Just the slightest hint that behind the man the public worshipped was a private world he guarded with quiet intensity. Throughout the 1950s, as his career grew, this contrast began to sharpen. On stage, he was unstoppable, a comedic force who could dance, sing, and command a room with a single expression. Off stage, he grew increasingly reflective, contemplative, even conflicted at times, as if living 2 emotional rhythms at once. He became the public's joyful companion, but privately wrestled with questions he never dared speak aloud. He wasn't living a lie, not yet, but he was beginning to understand that fame demanded something he wasn't prepared to give: complete access to who he truly was. And so, he learned to separate the two.
The man in the spotlight.
And the man walking back to the empty dressing room afterward. In those early years, no one recognized the significance of that separation. Not his co-stars, not reporters, not even his closest friends. After all, he always arrived with a smile, he always gave more than was asked, and he always delivered what audiences craved. But in time, the world would discover that these early divisions, these tiny cracks, were not harmless. They were the foundation of something far more profound, far more complicated, and far more hidden than anyone knew. A second life quietly forming in the shadows of the first. The 1960s were not just a decade of social change, they were a decade of masks. Hollywood perfected them. Studios enforced them.
Publicists polished them.
And actors wore them with a kind of quiet desperation, terrified of what would happen if the world ever saw them without their shine. Dick Van Dyke, with his buoyant charm and unshakable positivity, seemed like the last person in need of one. Yet as his fame skyrocketed, the pressure to maintain that perfect veneer grew heavier, more suffocating and more complex. What the public never saw was the machinery behind the magic, the agents who carefully crafted interviews, the studio executives who controlled public perception, and the unspoken Hollywood law. Never let the audience see you struggle.
Not with pressure. Not with fear.
Not with anything that might shatter the illusion. But Dick Van Dyke did struggle. Not with the work, that was effortless for him, but with the expectations that wrapped around his life like vines. Every smile had to be flawless. Every appearance had to reinforce the image. Every interview required him to be the kind of man audiences wanted him to be. And the world wanted him to be perfect. He felt it constantly, the eyes, the scrutiny, the need to live up to the character people believed he was. Actors of his generation often described Hollywood as a place where authenticity went to die. Personal truths were whispered only behind closed doors, and only in moments of absolute trust. Van Dyke was no exception. Not because he was deceptive, but because he was human. He felt emotions that didn't fit the Hollywood mold. He questioned himself in ways that didn't match the cheerful roles he played. He carried personal doubts that clashed with the image of the endlessly optimistic entertainer. Slowly, quietly, he began dividing his life into two worlds. Not intentionally, not with any sense of deception, but with the instinct of a man trying to protect pieces of himself that fame could not understand. There was the Dick Van Dyke the world loved, and then there was the man navigating the unseen storms inside him. And though no one realized it yet, those two identities would continue to pull further and further apart, until the divide between them would become impossible to ignore. Before the lights, before the fame, before the polished veneer of Hollywood, Dick Van Dyke's life was shaped by contradictions that later echoed throughout his career, and eventually throughout the mystery that would engulf him. He grew up in a small Midwestern world defined by simplicity, humility, and structure. His upbringing granted him values that became the moral compass audiences adored: kindness, honesty, warmth, and an almost stubborn optimism. But beneath that foundation lived something else: a restless curiosity, a desire to explore beyond expectations, and an inner complexity he rarely showed as a young man. From childhood, people noticed two versions of Dick. The performer, eager, energetic, full of joy. The observer, thoughtful, quiet, absorbing more than he revealed. These weren't contradictions yet, just facets. But they were the building blocks of the duality that would later define him. During his early adulthood, especially his time in the military and his first steps into entertainment, those contradictions deepened. He was drawn to people, yet guarded with his own emotions. He sought connection, yet often kept his deepest fears hidden. Fame amplified these traits. The more beloved he became, the more he withdrew the private parts of himself. Some say he feared disappointing the people who looked up to him. Others believe he simply didn't know how to merge the two worlds, the public joy and the private conflict. Even in the beginning, colleagues noticed something subtle: a distance in his eyes when he wasn't performing, a quietness that felt out of place for a man who brought so much laughter to others. He wasn't living a double life yet, but he was learning how to carry one. His success came fast and strong. By the time he broke into national fame, the contradictions within him were no longer harmless quirks. They were shaping the way he moved, spoke, and navigated the world. Pieces of himself were being tucked away, hidden where the public couldn't reach them. And slowly, the man the world believed they understood was becoming more of a character, while the real Dick Van Dyke slipped deeper into the privacy he built as a shield. The seeds of his double life were planted long before anyone suspected it. Long before any rumor. Long before any headline. And as his star rose higher, those seeds began to grow into something far more complex, a truth that would remain concealed for decades. Before the world labeled Dick Van Dyke a legend, he was simply a young husband trying to build a life with Margie Willett, a woman whose name would soon become overshadowed by his rising fame. Together they came from ordinary beginnings, a couple rooted in frugality and simplicity. Their wedding took place on a radio show because they couldn't afford the ceremony themselves. It wasn't glamorous, but it was heartfelt. And in that fragile sincerity, they entered a world neither of them fully understood. Hollywood had no instruction manual for marriages. Fame had even less mercy. As Van Dyke's star began to rise, the media wasted no time crafting a narrative around the couple. In magazines and television spots, they were the perfect, stable, unwavering American family. A household unmarred by ego or chaos. A wife supporting her husband's meteoric ascent, a husband grounded by love and domestic grace. But illusions, like shadows, are always longer in the presence of bright light. Behind the doors of their quiet home, pressures began forming. Pressures that didn't scream, but whispered. Long workdays, months away from home, missed birthdays, missed dinners, and the invisible ache of emotional distance became familiar visitors in their marriage. Van Dyke adored his children. He cherished the idea of home. But each year as his fame grew, he found himself living more in studio hallways than in his own living room. He rushed from stage sets to interviews, from rehearsals to meetings, always performing, always smiling, always giving the world the best version of himself. Yet at home, he felt himself stretching thin.
He wasn't cold. He wasn't distant by choice.
But the demands on him grew so large that the emotional balance of family life began to tilt silently, slowly, inevitably. Margie, meanwhile, found herself becoming the quiet figure in the background, the anchor the public rarely saw, the person carrying the weight every celebrity spouse knows too well: loneliness disguised as loyalty. From the outside, Their marriage seemed ideal. On the inside, small fractures were quietly forming, not out of betrayal, but out of exhaustion, separation, and the silent sacrifice that Hollywood expects but never acknowledges. It was the first great paradox of Van Dyke's life. The more the public embraced him as the perfect family man, the more fragile his family life became. And this contradiction would become the backbone of the decades-long double life myth that followed him. By the late 1960s, Dick Van Dyke was living a paradox that only a few people around him truly understood. He had become too visible to be genuinely seen. Fans recognized him everywhere, yet no one asked how he was holding up. Journalists praised his charm but ignored the weariness beneath it. Hollywood executives celebrated his success but overlooked the cost it carried. This disconnect between the man and the myth created fertile ground for stories. Stories that grew louder, stranger, and more elaborate with every passing year. Tabloids were relentless during this era.
They didn't need proof. They didn't need context. They needed a headline.
And what better headline than the idea that America's most wholesome entertainer might be harboring a mysterious life that contradicted everything he represented. A missed premiere due to exhaustion suddenly became evidence of secrecy. A quiet appearance at an event became proof of something hidden. His naturally private demeanor became signs of a double identity. The truth was far simpler. Van Dyke was a man overwhelmed by the weight of being everyone's favorite person. Yet the myth grew. The entertainment magazines of the time were notorious for blending reality with suggestion. A single ambiguous photograph, a single out-of-context quote, or a single moment of vulnerability could be transformed into a sprawling narrative of hidden truths. And when Van Dyke began navigating the complexities of his personal life, including growing emotional distance in his marriage and the internal struggles he later openly admitted, the tabloids found the perfect storm. Suddenly, stories emerged that he was living two lives, even though the reality was simply that he was struggling to balance one. A private man became a public mystery. A vulnerable human became a symbolic contradiction. And without ever intending it, Dick Van Dyke became the subject of a decades-long myth. A myth that painted him as someone fundamentally different from the man he truly was. It wasn't scandal that created the rumor.
It wasn't deception. It was silence.
The silence of a man who didn't want to burden the world with his inner turmoil. The silence of a family protecting their privacy. The silence of a celebrity trying to survive fame without losing himself. And for Hollywood tabloids, silence was the perfect canvas. Long before the public ever heard whispers, long before tabloids spun their stories, Dick Van Dyke faced a turning point in his life, one defined not by scandal, but by human vulnerability. In the 1970s, his relationship with Michelle Triola emerged quietly, thoughtfully, and painfully. To the outside world, it seemed sudden. To him, it was the result of years of emotional drift, loneliness, and the silent fractures that had spread across his marriage to Margie. Their connection wasn't born in secrecy. It was born in conversations, in understanding, in the comfort of someone who saw the parts of him he hid from the world. The tiredness, the guilt, the self-doubt, the quiet emotional weight that fame had given him. But to a world who thought they knew him perfectly, the relationship felt like a revelation, a rupture in the image they had held for decades.
For Van Dyke, however, it was far more complicated.
He adored his family. He respected Margie. But he could no longer deny the emotional truth he'd been carrying in silence. He was living unhappily, divided between the man he wanted to be and the man the world believed he already was. Guilt became a constant companion. He spoke openly, later in life, about the moral struggle he endured. The ache of trying to reconcile his own happiness with the hurt he feared causing others. It was one of the first times the world glimpsed the private turmoil behind the polished smile. But the media didn't focus on his honesty. They focused on the story. They didn't portray him as a man navigating heartbreak, emotional exhaustion, and the complexities of human relationships. They portrayed him as a man living two lives. Suddenly, the narrative exploded. Every quiet moment with Michelle became evidence. Every step away from his marriage became proof. Every uncomfortable silence became suspicion. Fans were confused. Reporters were relentless.
Publicists panicked.
But the truth was simple. Dick Van Dyke wasn't hiding a second life. He was trying to understand his own. What the world labeled scandal was, to him, a deeply human struggle, one that would follow him for decades in the form of rumors he never asked for. It wasn't the beginning of a double life. It was the breaking point of a man who had been living under a spotlight too bright for too long. The public never realized how much of Hollywood's history was defined not by glamour, but by secrecy, not the scandalous kind tabloids invented, but the protective silence cultivated by studios and publicists. Dick Van Dyke entered the industry at a time when truth was negotiable and image was everything. publicists were gatekeepers of perception, carefully curating the lives of their stars like museum exhibits. If an actor struggled, the studio hid it. If a marriage faltered, publicists buried it. If someone showed vulnerability, it was smoothed over before it ever reached the press. And Van Dyke, who deeply valued privacy, became a perfect participant in Hollywood's unspoken pact of silence. This wasn't conspiracy, it was culture. Interviews were rehearsed. Public appearances were coordinated. Even casual comments were filtered through the question: does this fit the version of him the world loves? When Dick admitted personal struggles, exhaustion, emotional conflict, or guilt, those admissions rarely left the room. His team protected him, not out of deception, but out of loyalty and fear of public misunderstanding. Hollywood wasn't protecting a secret. It was protecting an image, one that had become too iconic, too beloved, too fragile to be touched by human imperfection. But this protection had consequences. The more the publicists covered up struggles, the more tabloids filled in the blanks with wild speculation. The quieter Van Dyke became, the louder the rumors grew. Some stories were harmless exaggerations. Others were entirely fabricated. But all of them were built on the same foundation. The public only saw half of him, the polished half, and assumed the other must be hiding something dramatic. In reality, his hidden world wasn't scandalous. It was ordinary: human pain, human confusion, human vulnerability. But Hollywood had trained audiences to expect drama. So in silence, they invented their own. And thus, the myth of his double life tightened its grip on the public imagination. The truth had become irrelevant. The story had become everything. By the time Dick Van Dyke reached the height of his career, his life had become a split screen. Two realities running in perfect parallel, never intersecting, never merging. On one side was the man America adored.
Public Dick. Joyful. Energetic. Charming.
Dancing on rooftops, tripping over furniture, singing in perfect tune, laughing through every obstacle. To fans, he was the embodiment of positivity, a man untouched by sadness, fear, or conflict. But on the other side was a far quieter life. Private Dick.
Thoughtful. Reflective. Often uncertain.
Wrestling with guilt over his marriage, insecurity about fame, and the pressure of maintaining a persona too perfect to be real. What he lived internally was never sinister. It was simply complex, layered, and achingly human. But Hollywood didn't sell complexity. It sold characters. And so the public never saw the nights he sat in silence, questioning the future. They never saw the loneliness behind the curtain calls. They never saw the weight of making the world laugh while he struggled to understand himself. Every human carries two versions within them. For Dick Van Dyke, the world only recognized one, and misunderstood the other. Tabloids turned emotional conflict into secrets. Fans turned aging into mystery. Silence became evidence. Privacy became suspicion. And soon, the myth of his double life no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the world who believed they had uncovered some hidden truth. What actually happened was far simpler. Dick Van Dyke lived like any human being, balancing love, mistakes, growth, regret, and hope. But what the world saw was a legend whose smile never cracked. And when a smile never cracks, people assume something must be hiding behind it. For decades, whispers circled quietly around Dick Van Dyke's name, never loud enough to become headlines, yet persistent enough to linger in the shadows of his glowing public image. They floated through old studio hallways, drifted around backstage dressing rooms, and occasionally resurfaced when a biographer or gossip columnist wanted to stir interest. The idea was always the same. Had Dick Van Dyke, the man with a famously warm smile and gentle voice, been living a private emotional life separate from the one the world believed he had? These weren't sensational accusations. They were suspicions born from his career's unusual longevity, the long spans of time he spent away from home for film shoots, and the natural curiosity surrounding an entertainer whose public persona was so consistently wholesome that some wondered whether it was even possible for any human being to be that clean-cut. The rumors came from three major places. In an industry built on reinvention, nothing invites speculation more than a figure who refuses to change. Dick Van Dyke didn't have meltdowns. He didn't feud publicly.
He didn't self-destruct.
To some, that alone seemed suspicious. During the 1960s, the man was everywhere. The sitcom, the film sets, the stage appearances, the press circuits. People around him often joked that he seemed to have three versions of himself: the performer, the businessman, and the private citizen. Harmless observation, yes, but to outsiders, it fed the idea that one of these versions must have been doing something hidden. Dick Van Dyke was honest, brutally honest, about his flaws when he later opened up about his personal life. He admitted to moments of weakness, self-doubt, internal conflict, and choices he wished he had handled differently. Those admissions, ironically, became a breeding ground for myths. People filled in the blanks he never left. And so the rumors persisted. Not because they were true, but because mystery loves a vacuum. By the late 1990s, when his memoir began circulating, some readers thought they had finally found confirmation of a secret life. But the reality was far different. The truth was much simpler and far more human. He struggled, yes, just not in the way people imagined. The rumors lived because people wanted them to live. But the evidence? It simply wasn't there. Still, these whispers became a crucial part of the myth surrounding him, one that shaped how the next decade of speculation unfolded. Rumors may have painted a dramatic picture, but Dick Van Dyke himself offered something far more compelling than any tabloid fantasy: his truth. He wrote about the weight he carried quietly behind his charm. He spoke in interviews, gently, with his characteristic humility, about the emotional struggles he battled throughout his life. He acknowledged the pain he caused, the people he hurt, and the internal storms he tried to calm without letting the world see. These were the real things he hid, not a scandal, but a very human fragility. His greatest confession: he wore a smile even when he was breaking. On television, he was elastic and bright. At home, he sometimes battled loneliness, guilt, and confusion over who he wanted to be versus who he felt obligated to be. He never pretended he was perfect. But he also didn't broadcast his struggles, because he believed sadness had no place on the stage. This philosophy, noble as it was, created an illusion of a man untouched by hardship. He admitted to living with internal division. Not a double life, but a divided heart. Dick Van Dyke spoke openly about moments where he felt torn between responsibilities, relationships, and the relentless demands of stardom. The public never saw this turmoil, which led many to mistake his privacy for secrecy. But there is a difference. A double life implies deception. Privacy implies boundaries. He had the latter, never the former. The struggles he carried quietly. Self-doubt that plagued him even during his most successful years. Pressure to maintain a family while juggling an all-consuming career. Fear of disappointing those who believed in him. Internal conflicts about identity: actor, father, partner, public figure. These were not glamorized confessions. They were vulnerable admissions from a man who understood that the world he entertained had no space for unfinished emotions. He did not hide a secret life from the world. He hid his pain, because he didn't want it to dim the joy he brought to others. The phrase that would come to define the myth: Dick Van Dyke lived a double life for 30 years. Did not originate from any documented event. It came from a pattern. A pattern of misinterpreting the gaps. To understand how the myth even began, one must reconstruct the timeline, not through fantasy, but through facts. This was the era when Dick Van Dyke's fame reached its pinnacle. He was constantly working: film, television, Broadway, touring. The public rarely saw him outside the screen. Many assumed, if we never see him off camera, he must be doing something secret. But the real explanation was far less dramatic. He was working more hours than most people thought humanly possible. As he aged, Van Dyke began spending more time on personal projects, philanthropy, and quiet retreats away from the Hollywood spotlight. His life grew more private, not hidden, just peaceful. But for a man who had become a household presence for so long, that quietness raised eyebrows. Again, people filled in the blanks. Journalists and biographers tend to look for patterns, and where no pattern exists, they sometimes create one. So the narrative became: he disappeared from the Hollywood forefront for long stretches. Therefore, he must have been living a double life. But this overlooked the obvious reality. He was aging. He was choosing slower work. He was protecting his emotional energy. He was focusing on personal relationships and personal healing. No evidence of a hidden life. Only a man growing older and prioritizing differently. There were moments when fans believed they had uncovered something mysterious. Long breaks between major roles. Sudden shifts in personal life. Changes in public appearances. Occasional emotional interviews. But each of these moments was entirely consistent with the life of a man navigating normal human transitions: grief, change, growth, and self-discovery. Nothing matched the extravagant claims of a 30-year double life. The myth fell apart under every piece of real evidence. Dick Van Dyke didn't live a double life. He lived a very human life, one with chapters he shared, and chapters he kept for himself. And perhaps that is why the myth persisted for so long. Because mystery grows where privacy is respected. And people often struggle to believe that a man adored by millions could also be quietly, simply, imperfectly human. By the time Dick Van Dyke reached his later years, something in him shifted. He no longer felt the need to perform off-stage. He no longer needed to be the industry's eternal optimist. He simply wanted to be understood. This new honesty didn't come in dramatic confessions. It came quietly, gently, through interviews, public conversations, and candid reflections.
He spoke of identity.
He admitted that, at times, he felt like two different people. The cheerful entertainer. The introspective man who questioned himself. The human being who made mistakes and lived with their weight. This was the closest he ever came to acknowledging the double life rumor. Yet he wasn't describing a hidden world. He was describing the universal human experience of performing for others while trying to understand oneself.
He spoke of pressure.
He described the ache of being expected to uplift millions, even on days when he struggled to lift himself. He discussed the emotional toll of fame, the loneliness of long work schedules, and the difficulty of balancing relationships with a relentless career.
Again, not scandal. Not secrecy. Just humanity.
He spoke of regret, softly, honestly. He never portrayed himself as a victim or a saint. He acknowledged moments he wished he had handled differently. He took responsibility, even when he didn't have to. He showed remorse, even when the world had forgiven him long ago. This honesty shocked people, not because it was dramatic, but because it was rare. A celebrity revealing depth without destruction? A legend admitting vulnerability without collapse?
It wasn't a double life.
It was a life fully lived, finally revealed.
His real confession.
Fans were expecting, and some secretly hoping, for a dramatic revelation. Instead, what they received was far more profound.
I'm human. That's all.
It wasn't shocking in the tabloid sense. It was shocking because it stripped away the illusion that someone could live in the spotlight for 70 years without fractures or shadows. In this chapter of his life, the private man finally stepped into the light. Not to expose secrets, but to remind the world that no amount of fame erases the complexity of being human. There comes a moment in every legend story when the image begins to melt, not because it was false, but because time demands a fuller understanding. For Dick Van Dyke, this moment didn't happen suddenly. It wasn't sparked by a scandal, a leaked document, or a biography designed to shock. Instead, it emerged slowly, like silhouettes taking shape as fog lifts from a quiet morning. The illusion wasn't one he created. It was one the world built around him. For years, audiences clung to the idea that he was the embodiment of joy itself, an untouchable spirit who never felt the weight of the world. His performances were so bright, so effortless, that people assumed his life must have been just as luminous. And because the studio system protected this illusion so carefully, generations grew up believing he lived in a reality untouched by turmoil.
But as the decades passed, the public changed. The world changed.
Viewers were no longer satisfied with polished narratives or cardboard images of celebrities.
They wanted depth. They wanted humanity.
And more than anything, they wanted truth. Older interviews resurfaced. New conversations revealed a man speaking more openly than ever before. Documentaries explored the emotional cost of fame. Fans revisited his memoirs with fresh eyes, recognizing layers they had missed before. It was then that the illusion began to break, not in shattering pieces, but in gentle, revealing folds. People realized that the man behind the cheerful persona had carried burdens, choices, and regrets quietly, with a grace that made them almost invisible. Suddenly, the myth of the double life felt less like a scandal and more like a misunderstanding born from decades of curated appearances. As audiences confronted the reality of his private struggles, something remarkable happened.
The truth didn't diminish him. It deepened him.
What had once been a symbol of simple joy became a portrait of courage. A man who smiled not because life was perfect, but because he believed in lifting others even when he couldn't lift himself. The illusion didn't vanish because it was wrong. It vanished because the world was finally ready to see the whole man. With the illusion stripped away, what remained was far more compelling than any myth ever whispered about him. The real Dick Van Dyke was a tapestry of resilience, warmth, vulnerability, and a sincerity that echoed through every chapter of his life. He was not the flawless figure fans imagined, yet he was something richer, a man who never stopped trying to live with honesty, humility, and heart. He spoke openly about the struggles he faced, not to shock anyone, but because he believed transparency could help others. When he reflected on his life, he didn't hide from moments that pained him. He acknowledged mistakes with a type of grace that few ever display publicly. What people found most striking was how gently he talked about the past. Never defensive, never self-pitying, just a man looking back on his journey with clear eyes. He adored the people in his life, and those relationships shaped him more deeply than fame ever could. His connections with family, partners, and longtime colleagues revealed a man who valued loyalty, kindness, and forgiveness. Even during turbulent times, he tried to anchor himself in compassion. That was the real him, not a man living secretly, but one living sincerely. Throughout his career, he brought a rare sense of light to everything he touched. It wasn't an artificial brightness. It came from a belief that joy mattered, especially when the world felt heavy. Behind every performance was a desire to remind people that laughter, music, and imagination could still heal. His work endured because it carried the soul of someone who understood struggle, yet chose optimism anyway. The real Dick Van Dyke wasn't defined by rumors or speculation. He was defined by resilience. He lived through personal challenges but never allowed them to harden him. He grew older but never lost his capacity for wonder. He faced the public's expectations but refused to let them turn him into something he wasn't. In the end, the most surprising truth about him was beautifully simple.
He didn't need a double life.
His real life was already extraordinary. The turning point did not arrive with fanfare. It came quietly, in a moment when fans, historians, and filmmakers realized that the long-standing rumors of a hidden life simply didn't match the man standing in front of them. For years, people expected a shocking revelation, something explosive, dramatic, or scandalous. But the truth that finally emerged was more intimate, more unexpected, and far more profound. What truly surprised people was never a secret affair, a hidden scandal, or a long-buried mystery. It was his vulnerability,
His honesty,
his willingness to speak candidly about his inner battles in a world that had only ever permitted him to be cheerful. When he opened up about the emotional complexities he carried throughout his life, the public discovered a dimension to him that had always existed, hidden not by intention but by the glow of his public persona. As audiences learned more about his private reflections, they found themselves re-evaluating everything they thought they knew. Interviews where he gently admitted to feeling isolated, chapters in his memoir where he expressed regret, and rare moments where he let the facade slip, all became newly understood as pieces of a larger truth. He had not been hiding a double life. He had been navigating a deeply human one, full of contradictions, hopes, disappointments, and growth. This revelation shocked people even more than any scandal would have, because it reminded them that behind every legend is a person who feels, falters, and evolves. The notion that someone so beloved could also struggle with self-doubt or emotional turmoil was more impactful than any secret ever could be. And when the truth emerged, it did something remarkable. It did not tarnish him.
It elevated him.
Fans no longer saw him as a flawless icon built by Hollywood. They saw him as a man who had survived fame, pressure, mistakes, and expectations with grace. They saw a man who had loved deeply, learned continuously, and lived authentically even when misunderstood. The revelation wasn't that he lived a double life. The revelation was that he lived a life deeper and more human than anyone ever imagined. There is a quiet strength in a person who can acknowledge their flaws without letting those flaws define them. For Dick Van Dyke, this strength became one of the most remarkable threads woven through the fabric of his life. While the world often painted him as a sunny, flawless figure, the truth was gentler and far more inspiring. He never hated the parts of himself that struggled.
Instead, he learned from them.
Throughout his life, he spoke with a disarming openness about the moments he wished he had handled differently. But instead of burying these memories or allowing them to darken his spirit, he confronted them with honesty. His reflections carried no bitterness, only a desire for growth. Many celebrities spend their lives running from the shadows of their mistakes, yet Dick Van Dyke faced his with humility, transforming them into stepping stones rather than stumbling blocks. As he moved through the different seasons of his life, he discovered that imperfections were not weaknesses to be hidden but opportunities to become more compassionate. The man who danced across rooftops in Mary Poppins and charmed millions on television was also a man who understood sorrow, regret, and the weight of being imperfect. And instead of resenting those emotions, he embraced them as part of his journey. His understanding of love deepened because of his imperfections. He came to realize that relationships are not strengthened by perfection but by honesty, by showing up as a whole person, not a polished illusion. He learned that real love demands vulnerability, and through that vulnerability, he found greater connection. Those who knew him best often spoke of his ability to forgive, not only others but himself, which allowed him to evolve rather than remain trapped by the past. As he aged, his perspective shifted in ways that only time can teach. He began to speak more openly about the pressures of fame and the hollowness that can accompany it if one forgets to nurture the soul. Yet he never spoke in anger. He never blamed Hollywood or the expectations placed upon him. Instead, he acknowledged that every challenge had shaped him into a person with deeper empathy and greater resilience. Even as rumors and myths swirled around him for decades, he did not allow bitterness to creep into his heart.
He knew who he was.
He understood that people would always create stories, always search for drama behind a joyful face. But he remained grounded in the truth that his imperfections made him relatable, not fragile. He believed that embracing one's own humanity was the only path to peace. And perhaps that is why he continued to inspire long after many of his peers had faded from view. His legacy was not built solely on the roles he played or the laughter he brought into the world, but on the courage he showed in accepting himself fully. He carried his mistakes with grace, allowing them to guide him, to soften him, to deepen the joy he eventually became known for. In the end, the power of Dick Van Dyke lay not in perfection, but in the gentle wisdom of a man who understood that true strength comes from loving yourself even when you falter. His imperfections did not diminish him, they made him unforgettable.